I want to start this talk on energy by reading to you a quotation of something that was written some time ago by an eminent expert on energy. And here it goes. Day by day it becomes more evident that the oil we happily possess in excellent quality and abundance is the mainspring of modern material civilization. Oil, in truth, stands not beside but entirely above all other commodities. It is a material source of the energy of the country, the universal aid, the factor in everything we do. It can be no matter of surprise that year by year we make larger drafts upon a material of such myriad qualities, of such miraculous powers. The question concerning the duration of our present cheap supplies of oil cannot but excite deep interest and anxiety wherever or whenever it is mentioned, for a little reflection will show that oil is almost the sole necessary basis of our material power. The constant tendency of discovery is to render oil a more and more efficient agent, while there is no probability that when our oil is used up, any more powerful substitute will be forthcoming. We cannot make up for a future want of oil by importation from other countries. Considering how greatly our manufactures and navigation depend upon oil, and how vast is our consumption of it compared with that of other nations, it cannot be supposed that we shall do without oil more than a fraction of what we do with it. It is then simply inferred that we cannot long continue our present rate of progress. All things considered, it is not reasonable to suppose or expect that the power of oil will ever be superseded by anything better. It is a naturally best source of power, as air and water and gold and iron are, each for its own purposes, the most useful of substances, and such as will never be superseded. I draw the conclusion that we cannot long maintain our present rate of increase of consumption, that the cost of fuel must rise to a rate injurious to our commercial and manufacturing supremacy, and the conclusion is inevitable that our present happy progressive condition is a thing of limited duration. The alternatives before us are simple. We have to take the momentous choice between brief but true greatness and longer continued mediocrity. Now, if I were to ask you questions about who wrote that and when, I suspect most of you would say, well, that must have been written about 5 or 6 years ago by a very, very prescient man, a man who really saw the future very well. Well, the truth to tell, those words, with one exception where I have taken liberty with it, that I'll come back to, were written in a book first published in 1865. The one exception is that everywhere I read the word oil, the original had the word coal, and it dealt with Great Britain and not with the United States. The excerpts I have read to you are from a book called The Coal Question, written by a great English economist, W. Stanley Jevons, and published in 1865. And he, at that time, in writing about the coal question, said exactly the same thing, as you can see, that our supposed experts have been saying about the oil question in these recent years. He was wrong, as you realize, and indeed, I may say, he was even more farsighted. He went farther. In the course of his investigation of this, he considered all possibilities, including the possibility that you might use airplanes instead of as a way of economizing on coal. And he wrote, uncertainty will forever render aerial conveyance a commercial impossibility. Even if an aerial machine could be propelled by some internal power from 50 to 100 miles an hour, it could not make head against a gale. He went on. This was 1865. But as you may know, oil and petroleum had been discovered, and he wrote, petroleum has of late years become the matter of a most extensive trade, and has been found admirably adapted for use in marine steam engine boilers. Its natural supply is far more limited and uncertain than that of coal, and an artificial supply can only be had by the distillation of some kind of coal at considerable cost. To extend the use of petroleum, then, is only a new way of pushing the consumption of coal. It is more likely to be an aggravation of the drain than a remedy. Well, that's come full circle. We are now talking about how coal will save us from the shortage of oil. And he was talking about how oil could not save you from the shortage of coal. Now, as I say, what conclusion do we draw from that? Jevons was a very eminent and able man. He was no charlatan. He was one of the great economists of the 19th century. But he was dead wrong. Should we draw the problem that therefore, the conclusion that therefore no problem will arise? Not at all. After all, at least one of his predictions was correct. You will remember he said we have to make the momentous choice between brief but true greatness and longer continued mediocrity. And after all, Great Britain has now descended to long continued mediocrity. Not for the reasons that Jevons supposed, but for very different reasons. I don't believe we should draw the conclusion that no problem will arise. Or should we draw the conclusion that two economists from Rand, Fred Huffman and Richard Nerung, recently stated in an article in a publication produced by that admirable Institute of Contemporary Studies that Laurie Chickering is associated with? They said, and I quote, "Design of prudent energy policy under such uncertainty requires analysis of the implications of alternative resource estimates. These results should be tested in more detailed calculations than those presented and for sensitivity to key assumptions." That is, they are saying that given such uncertainty, what we have to do is to try to pin it down and make sure how much future resources we have. That's not the right conclusion either. On the contrary, all that is a proposal for a make-work project for unemployed economists and engineers. It's doubtful if any amount of research of the kind that Huffman and Nerung proposed would have enabled William Stanley Jevons to foresee the discovery of North Sea oil. The fact is that we cannot get out of the problem by being able to predict things that are not predictable. That the right conclusion is that the crystal ball is inevitably cloudy, that is the nature of the world we live in, that all specific predictions about the precise amount of this, that, or the other deserve skepticism, that what we need is not the kind of specific, detailed blueprint for the future that Huffman and Nerung would like to produce, that what we need is an adjustment mechanism that will enable us to adapt to what happens as it develops. And of course, as everybody in this room knows, there is such a system, namely the price mechanism, which successfully steered us over several centuries from wood to coal to whale oil to petroleum to natural gas. That is a mechanism in which it is in the self-interest of hundreds and thousands and millions of people to make their best guesses about the future, in which it's unnecessary to have a single blueprint, in which you have an automatic adjustable mechanism as things develop. If we have a problem today in the energy area, as we do, it is solely, in my opinion, because that system has not been allowed to work. The problem in energy and in the approach to energy is part of a much broader problem, and a problem which we will be faced with and have been faced with in a variety of other areas and not merely in the energy area. It is what you might call the difference between the economic way of thinking and the engineering way of thinking. The broader problem is very much epitomized by the famous Club of Rome report, Limits of Growth, which got so much attention a few years ago. You will all recall that that was a report in which engineers were saying we have finite resources, a finite amount of coal, a finite amount of space, and so on and so on. Things grow at exponential rates, and so long as things grow at exponential rate, they're ultimately going to become infinite. And since resources are finite, we're going to bump into it, and therefore we are faced with a terrible future in which sooner or later we're going to run out of steel or coal or whatever you want to name we're going to run out of. And we really have to adjust our sights. We can no longer take the view that we can have growth forever. And we must recognize that there are, in their title, limits to growth, and reconcile ourselves. It's the same approach that was developed by the late Mr. Schumacher in his emphasis on the idea that small is beautiful. It's the kind of an approach that underlies the appeal of zero growth, of the notion that resources are finite. For example, in the energy case, literally echoing Jevons, you could almost have taken it out of Jevons, a recent report of the Committee for Economic Development, an organization of American businessmen, says, and I quote, "The era of abundant, cheap energy is over. The people of the U.S. must face the fact that there will be significant changes in the mix of energy that they use, and that energy is going to cost more." Now, this approach, whether adopted by the Club of Rome, or by Mr. Schumacher, or by the CAD, is completely wrong. The plain fact is that from an economic point of view, the volume of resources available to us is larger today than it has ever been in history. We are less dependent today on natural resources than we have ever been. Tell me, do we have more energy resources available today than Jevons thought we had at the time he wrote? Of course we do. If you go back 20 years before Jevons, before the oil was discovered in any significant amount, the volume of energy available was much less, because as long as we didn't know about that oil, it wasn't a resource available. In this country, in the 1920s, there was a great uproar about the fact that the total volume of reserves of petroleum available would only last 10 or 20 years. Today, the total volume of reserves, of known reserves, is higher than it has ever been, not only in absolute barrels, but relative to a year's consumption, relative to the population. How can that, what's true in the case of oil is true in the case of all of these other natural resources. Invention, discovery, innovation has enabled us to discover substitutes for natural resources. It has enabled us to learn how to use them more effectively, to recycle them. If you look at it from a different point of view, suppose you ask yourself what fraction of the total income of the nation comes from basic natural resources. Well, if you were going back 200 years ago, that would have been a very, very large fraction, because agriculture would have been the dominant industry. It would have been the productivity of the land that would have been the major element. Today, the total contribution of natural resources to our national income is probably of the order of 10%. The great improvement has been in the use of services, in the development of ways of getting along without natural resources, or of discovering more natural resources.